The Nobel Prize-winning poet and playwright Sir Derek Walcott has died in his homeland of St Lucia. He was 87. As our arts editor Will Gomber's report, he's regarded as one of the most leading voices of West Indian literature.
Derek Walcott found he was often defined as a black writer, which is not how he saw himself. He was, he said, first and foremost, a Caribbean writer.
I think the elation that is always there in a Caribbean morning, right? Or the kind of elegiac elation that's there in a Caribbean sunset is part of the rhythm of the feel of a Caribbean people.
Dante, Shakespeare, Chaucer and Yeats were all addressed and reassessed through his literary lens, as was Homer in 1990, when he wrote his epic poem Omeros, in which Achilles is relocated and living among the fishermen of the West Indies.
Then a black fisherman, his stubbled chin coarse as a dry sea urchin's, hoisted his flour sack sail on the bamboo spar.
2 years later, he was awarded the Nobel Prize for Literature. His international reputation was sealed. He wrote and taught and inspired.
He said, you know, you and I were on the same road. So to hear that from somebody like him, this is 5 years before he won the big prize and all that, it was amazing, you know, and I still feel it. I just followed him down the road. Yeah. Okay, he's gone over the horizon today, but I'm still following.
Derek Walcott's life was not without controversy. An accusation of sexual harassment by female students in the US led to him being very publicly overlooked for the Oxford Professor of Poetry post in 2009. He continued to write, and in 2011 was awarded the T.S. Eliot Prize for Poetry.
He wrote poetry the way most people walk. He had a kind of an all-consuming passion for poetry. He was a force of nature as a poet.
In the flags of the Indian fields.
Derek Walcott used his unique poetic voice to explore and explain the world from a largely unseen perspective, and in so doing, illuminated the immediate and the universal.
Well, Dr. Keithley Woolward is president of the Caribbean Studies Association, and he joins me now from Nassau in the Bahamas. Thank you for your time, sir. I mean,
you're most welcome.
Thank you so much. You describe, first of all, if you could describe your experience of Sir Derek Walcott. You met him, didn't you? What did you make of him?
Well, we had the pleasure of welcoming him here to the Bahamas in 2009 for one of our most important memorial lecture series that we held in the fall. He was, of course, a distinguished gentleman who had an amazing way with words, of course, but had a great sense of humor. And one of the things, as was just reported in the segment just before this, is that he was deeply inspired by the Caribbean region. One of the things that happened in our sort of more intimate conversation in the small group after the lecture was him talking about the fact that driving through the streets of Nassau, he could get a glimpse of what it meant to be in a Caribbean town, the small chattel houses, a certain kind of vibrancy in the streets, the voices of people as they walked about taking care of their own affairs during the day is something that came to his ear as he was traveling from the hotel to the university. And so that was an important aspect of the interaction that I had with him and those in the room with him. But that speaks to the inspiration.
I'm going to come back to the question of the influence that the Caribbean had in his writing, but I think we have a clip of Sir Derek Walcott reading some of his poetry now, so let's just have a listen to that.
Yes.
I said, Omeros, and O was a conch shell's invocation. Mer was both mother and sea in our Antillean patois. Os, a grey bone, and the white surf as it crashes and spreads its sibilant collar on a lace shore. Omeros was a crunch of dry leaves and the washes that echoed from a cave mouth when the tide has ebbed. The name stayed in my mouth.
I mean, just talk a little bit about the impact that having the Caribbean almost as a character in this writing, in this poetry, had on other poets and yourself.
Well, one of the things that Derek Walcott certainly paid attention to, and we heard it here as he was reading from Omeros, is the way that his work was very much anchored in the Caribbean region. That Caribbean vernacular, that Caribbean folklore culture was an important part of how he found inspiration in the space that would produce him, initially in St. Lucia, and then eventually moving on to Trinidad, where he would become very much involved in theater. The very concreteness of the visual imagery of his work is something that is one of the most important elements of Derek Walcott. But I also want to point out the fact that he was also an incredibly well-known and well-accomplished playwright. And his plays have had significant impact also on the evolution of theater and the theater arts in the Caribbean region. And there, particularly because he was very much interested in Caribbean folklore and fairy tale traditions, and most significantly, the street festival, particularly as one can witness in the Trinidad Carnival. So the influence of the Caribbean region on his work, his visualizing and retelling of that experience through his poetry and through his theater, for me as someone who teaches literature, the literature of the Caribbean region, it's really important, particularly today, as we introduce students to the work of this great poet, how very much he speaks to the Caribbean experience. And though texts were written in particular times and spaces, they continue to speak to our contemporary moment.
He spoke to the Caribbean experience, but it wasn't just people from that background or people familiar with that experience that appreciated his works, was it?
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, one of the things that certainly marks Derek Walcott, but I believe the Caribbean region in general, is that you can work from a space that is local and specific, but also have universal reach. And I think his Omeros is exemplary of that. So he takes on Homer's recounting of the Trojan Wars and resets them into a fishing village that could be in St. Lucia, that could be in St. Kitts and Nevis, that could be in Trinidad. And there, that speaks outwards to larger global themes about home, about anchoring oneself in place and time, working through the legacies, particularly of colonialism, and the struggle for finding a national voice in the wave of independence movements of the 1960s. Those are themes that can be found universally.
Universal themes. Dr. Keithley Woolward, we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you so much for giving your memory.